The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that from the Pasuk Vasuli Migdash Shachanti B'Soicham, the Rambam learns in Hilchas Beis Abchira that mitzvah saseh, we have a positive mitzvah to make a house for Hashem prepared in which we are going to offer karbonos, as the Pasuk says, Va'asuli Mikdash. The Rambam goes on to say that the Torah specifies specifically the Mishkan the Moshe Rabbeinu made, but that was only temporary, as the Pasuk says, Kilei Bosam Ad Ata, that up until now you didn't come to the place of rest and so on. In Hilchas Malachim, the Rambam learns this same mitzvah from a different pasuk. The Rambam says over there, Shalosh mitzvahs, 3 mitzvahs the Yidden are commanded when they come into Eretz Yisrael. One of them is to build the Beis HaBechira. The Rambam brings the pasuk, L'shichnoi sidrishu, you should seek the place where Hashem is going to rest, Uvas Hashem, and you will come there. So the question is a famous one: why does the Rambam not bring the same pasuk that he brings in the beginning of Hilchos Beis Abchira, the pasuk of Asuli Migdash? So the Lechem Mishnah answers that the pasuk of Asuli Migdash was speaking about the Mishkan that was made in the Midbar, whereas the pasuk L'shichnoi sidrishu is referring to Mishkan Shiloi, the Mishkan that was built in Shiloi, as Rashi also explains. And the Lechem Mishnah goes on to say, and just like in Shiloi and in the Midbar there was a mitzvah, so certainly the building of the Beis Abchira that's in Yerushalayim is also a mitzvah. But the Rebbe says it's not understood. Since the Rambam is counting the building of the house for Hashem in Hilchas Beis Abchira clearly as a mitzvah saseh, which means that it's a mitzvah for future generations, why is he bringing a pasuk that's the command for building the Mishkan? Again, that pasuk of Asuli Migdash. And generally it's difficult to understand that in Hilchas Beis HaBechira, which as its name implies, that the whole point of these halachis is the mitzvah saseh for all future generations of the building the Beis HaMikdash, here he should be bringing the pasuk, which is a command for the Mishkan and the Midbar. And in Hilchas Melachim, which as its name implies, is mainly dealing with the halachis of a king and appointing a king, here he's going to bring the pasuk L'shichnoi sidrishu, which is speaking about the Mishkan Shiloi and the Beis HaMikdash. How do we understand this? Says the Rebbe, seemingly we would be able to say that the Rambam in Hilchas Beis Abchira is bringing the pasuk V'asuli Migdash not as a command for the building of the Mishkan, as we had just said, but rather that from this we learn the general mitzvah of the building the Beis HaMikdash, as we do find in the Medrashim that the building of the Beis HaMikdash is learned from this pasuk. But if that's the case, it's the question then becomes the other way around. Why is it then that by the halacha, as the Rambam says it in Hilchas Malachim regarding the Beis HaMikdash, why does he then over there bring a different pasuk of L'shichnoi sidrishu uvas hashama? And what's even more difficult, says the Rebbe, is that it sounds from the expression, from the language of the Rambam and so on, that the source of his words in Hilchos Malachim about the mitzvahs that the Yidden are commanded when they come into Eretz Yisrael comes from the Medrash. And when we look at the Medrash, that seemingly the source for the Rambam, the Medrash actually brings the pasuk of Asuli Mikdash concerning the Beis HaMikdash, not the pasuk of L'shichnoi sidrishu. And this is what the Medrash says. Al shloisha dvarim nitztavu Yisrael b'kneisas ha'aretz. Yidden were commanded for 3 things when they came into Eretz Yisrael: to appoint a king, to build the Beis HaMikdash, and to destroy Amalek. The Medrash goes on and says to appoint a king, as the pasuk says, Shem tasam alech hamelech, to build the Beis HaMikdash, as it says, va'asuli mikdash, and to destroy Amalek, as the pasuk says, V'haya ba'aniach Hashem alekecha, when Hashem will give you rest from all of the enemies and so on, you should destroy Amalek. So what do we see? That in this very same point regarding these 3 mitzvahs, the Medrash uses the pasuk for the Beis HaMikdash, the pasuk of Asuli Migdash. Why is it then that the Rambam in Hilchas Beis in Malachim, where he speaks about these 3 mitzvahs, why does he change from what the Medrash says? And also the change from the pasuk that he himself brought in Hilchas Beis Abchira and brings this other pasuk of L'shichnoi sidrishu. We also need to understand that in truth, for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, we have a different pasuk, which is a very, very clear command, not the pasuk of Asuli Migdash, which simply is referring to the Mishkan. We have a pasuk that says, V'haya hamakim Asher yivchar Hashem ulekecha boy, l'shaken shmoi sham, the place that Hashem is going to choose to rest His name over there. We find in the Gemara and in the Sifri that they apply this to the Beis HaMikdash. So why is it that the Rambam doesn't bring this pasuk? The Rambam is the one that's speaking about a mitzvah that's going to be for all future generations. Why doesn't he bring this pasuk in the beginning of Hilchos Beis Abchira? The Kesef Mishnah answers that the Rambam is learning that this pasuk of Ahoya HaMakoim is not actually coming as a command to build a Beis HaMikdash, but rather it's more like stating a fact or a narrative. In other words, the pasuk is saying, you need to bring karbonos to that place that Hashem is going to choose, but it's not a command for building the Beis HaMikdash per se. And the fact that the Gemara and the Sifri do bring this pasuk, it's only coming, the Gemara and the Sifri are really bringing this pasuk not to say that this pasuk is telling us that it's a mitzvah, rather it's coming to prove that you first need to get rid of Amalek and then build a Beis HaMikdash, because in this pasuk, the pasuk first says, before this pasuk, it says that when Hashem will give you rest from all of your enemies, so then you will come to this place that Hashem will choose and you'll bring karbonis. But not that this pasuk itself is telling us the mitzvah. But the Rebbe says, according to this, well, first of all, in addition to the fact that it's not so smooth based on a famous rule in the Rambam, that he brings that which will be a simpler drasha, even if it's not in the Gemara. And so too should have been in this case. You just bring the simple pasuk that's speaking about the Beis HaMikdash. But even more so, here he seems to be not the simple pasuk. But the question over here, says the Rebbe, is why is it that the Rambam doesn't at least bring this pasuk in Hilchos Malachim when he's speaking about the three mitzvahs? Why doesn't he bring this pasuk to show us that you need to first get rid of Amalek and then build the Beis HaMikdash? Another thing, says the Rebbe, we need to understand in Hilchos Beis Abchira is that after the Rambam concludes in Halacha Aleph, Ukvar Nesparish B'Torah, that the Torah tells us clearly about the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made, and that was only temporary. As the pasuk says, we brought this before, that you didn't come until now to Menucha and Nachla, to a resting place and so on. The Rambam goes on in the next halacha and says, once the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael, they set up the Mishkan in Gilgal. It stood over there for 14 years, the 14 years when they were conquering and dividing Eretz Yisrael. From there they came to Shiloh. They built a house of stone, and over it they spread the yeriyos, the curtains of the Mishkan on top of it, and that did not have a proper ceiling, a proper roof. This Mishkan stood for 369 years, and then when Eli passed away, it was destroyed. They then came to a place called Noiv, and they built a mikdash over there. When Shmuel passed away, that was destroyed. They then came to a place called Givoin, and they built a mikdash over there. And from Givoin, they finally came to the eternal place, the Beis HaElamim, the Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam concludes by saying that the time of Noiv and Givoin together was 57 years. Says the Rebbe, it's very difficult to understand. The Rambam is a sefer of halachos. Why is it relevant to halacha, this whole arichos elaborating so much? How this Mishkan was set up in Gilgal and then in Shiloh and in Noiv and in Givoin. This is seemingly is just telling us some history. Yes, it's true that the source of the Rambam, of this order of the Batei Mikdash and the Mishkanos, is coming from a Mishnah in Masechta Zvachim. But in Mishnayos, there are a number of things that are not halachos, whereas the Sefer Hayad of the Rambam consists of halachos, of clear-cut halachos. Furthermore, even in the Mishnah, it's not only just telling us as a nice piece of history about the order of these buildings and these structures. It's telling us actually connected with certain halachos and dinim that are relevant to these things. There's something called a bama, sort of a mizbeach that's a temporary mizbeach, not in a mishkan, not in the Beis HaMikdash. So there are halachos that are connected and relevant to these mishkanos. The Mishnah says that when they came to Gilgal, they were now allowed to have bamos, and there are certain places where the Kodesh Kadoshim are allowed to be eaten. So how is that right? We know that when they have the Beis HaMikdash, it can only be eaten in the Azara. So now these halachos are going to be relevant by these different mishkanos. So when it came to Shiloh, you were not allowed to make any of these bamos anymore. The Mishnah says when you came to Noiv and Givoin, you were allowed to make these bamos. And this is all an introduction and telling us that finally when they come to Yerushalayim, you're no longer allowed to make any of these private, personal mizbechos, these bamos, and they were never allowed anymore. And now this Yerushalayim is now called the Nachla, the inheritance, the permanent place of the Mishkan, of the Shechina, of the Kedusha of the Shechina. However, the Rambam doesn't mention any of this. And the reason for this is understood because whatever happened in the past happened, and therefore it's seemingly not relevant in the Rambam. And the halacha in the Rambam, when the Rambam says that once the Beis HaMikdash was built in Yerushalayim, you're no longer allowed to build any other place for Hashem to bring karbonis over there. It's not even relevant over there, the fact that when they were in Gilgal, they were allowed to bring these karbonis on these private mizbechos, and when they were in Shiloh, you were not allowed to. So the Rambam, amidst the whole thing, doesn't even mention it. And therefore the question is even stronger. So why does he bring about all these different places, about Gilgal and Shiloh and so on? Furthermore, says the Rebbe, the Rambam specifies the amount of years that they were in each one of these places. And this, says the Rebbe, is definitely only a matter of history, of what happened, how long it was there for. And these are things that are not even brought in the Mishnah, the amounts of years. So why is this all relevant in the Rambam? Why is the Rambam bringing this? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this all by prefacing, first, the reason why in Hilchis Malachim, when he speaks about the mitzvah of appointing a king, the Rambam also brings the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. He brings all these three mitzvahs of appointing a king, destroying Amalek, and building the Beis HaMikdash. So too in Sefer HaMitzvahs, when the Rambam counts the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, the Rambam says that Hashem commanded us to build a place to serve Him, as the Eibishter tells us, V'asu li mikdash. And then the Rambam goes on, quoting the Sifri, that Shalosh mitzvahs netztava Yisrael, Yidden were given 3 mitzvahs when they came into Eretz Yisrael, to appoint a king, and to build a Beis HaMikdash, and to destroy Amalek. And here again, it's not understood. Why are these other 2 mitzvahs relevant right over here when we're speaking about the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash? The Rebbe says also, the fact that the Rambam says, he starts like the Gemara and the Sifri, Shalosh mitzvahs, there are 3 mitzvahs, seemingly, these are just extra words. The Rambam himself, as the Gemara and Sifri, are about to tell us the 3 mitzvahs, so why is it important to introduce it by first saying the number that there are 3 mitzvahs? To use a famous expression of Shas, where the Gemara will ask a similar question, Minyana Lamali, why is it relevant to tell us the number? Now we can say that the reason is based on something that Rashi tells us. Rashi says that the reason we are told about these 3 mitzvahs, we are being told that they're dependent on each other, that they have to be done in order. First you have to have a king, then you get rid of Amalek, then you have the Beis HaMikdash, because that still it does tell us why we're being told about all 3 of them together, but it still doesn't tell us why it's important to introduce it by saying there are 3 mitzvahs. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, these 3 mitzvahs, as we just quoted from Rashi, are dependent on each other. That means they are not 3 separate mitzvahs. Although they are 3 separate mitzvahs, nevertheless, each one of these mitzvahs is also like a detail and a part. It's bringing shleimus, it's bringing wholesomeness also into the other 2. That means the only way appointing a king can be done properly is when it also is going to lead to the fact that he destroys Amalek and going to build a Beis HaMikdash. And so too in regards to the other mitzvahs. The only way you can have the Beis HaMikdash properly is if you first appointed a king and you also fought Amalek. It's in continuation to this that we learn from the pasuk that the connection of these mitzvahs to each other are also in regards to their order. In other words, you first need to have the appointment of a king, then you need to destroy Amalek, and then comes the building of the Beis HaMikdash. That means it's not only an order as far as the obligation and the fulfillment of the mitzvah of the way the Yid is doing it, that a Yid, the Gavra, the person, is commanded to do 3 things. But it's also as far as it's important to the Minui Melech itself, to the appointment of the king itself. In other words, part of the Geder of the Melech, in order for me to be a Melech properly, is the fact that he's going to have to fight Amalek and build a Beis HaMikdash. And so too, part of the Geder of the Beis HaMikdash needs that there should have been appointed a king and that Amalek was fought. Says the Rebbe, this is also why the Rambam in Halacha Beis brings the psukim regarding David HaMelech. The pasuk says, Vayihiki Yashav HaMelech b'Beisoi, when the king was sitting in his house, and Hashem gave him rest from all of his enemies. The king said to Nasan HaNovi, I am sitting in this house of Arozim, in the cedar house, and what about Hashem? Where is the Shechina? Where is the Aron? In other words, the proof for this pasuk is not only about the fact of the order of the mitzvahs. for that would have been enough. Also the first psukim that the Gemara brings, where the pasuk says that once Hashem will give you rest from all of your enemies, then you'll have the place that Hashem chooses in which you'll bring karbonis and so on. But more importantly, that it's part of the geder of the fulfillment of the mitzvah of the melech itself, and part of the king and destroying Amalek and so on, as the pasuk says, "Vayehi ki yashav hamelech bebeisei." Once the king was sitting in his house, and Hashem gave him rest from all of his enemies. Then the king says, "We need to build a Beis Hamikdash." Says the Rebbe, now we'll also understand why the Rambam brings all of these three mitzvahs in Hilchis Malachim, also the mitzvah of building a Beis Hamikdash, because they are so much dependent and connected with each other. Says the Rebbe, now we can also understand what the Rambam says in the beginning of Hilchos Beis Hamikdash when he says, mitzvah sasei, that it's a mitzvah to make a house for Hashem, to bring karbonis. As the pasuk says, va'asuli mikdash. And the Rambam goes on to say that the Torah tells us specifically about the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu made, and how that was only temporary. That means that the building of the house of Hashem, that we are commanded in this mitzvah, it applies and refers to immediately also to that Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made. And since the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash is connected also with these other two mitzvahs that we said, in other words, in order for the Beis HaMikdash to be proper, it's also important to have first the appointment of a king and to be able to rest from fighting with Amalek. We must say that this applies, and this happened also by all of these other Batei Mikdash. In other words, even though it's true, yes, that as commands, as mitzvahs, the Yidden were commanded in these three mitzvahs only once they come into Eretz Yisrael, but that's only as far as they are three distinct separate mitzvahs. Yes, they are going to need to be doing these mitzvahs when they come into Eretz Yisrael. But since we just said that the whole gather of building a house for Hashem, which is really one mitzvah for all generations, a mitzvah of Asuli Migdash, it's one mitzvah that extends over all the generations. And this includes also not only the Beis HaMikdash, but also those previous structures that existed beforehand. So it's understood that also by each one of these structures, by each one of these Mishkanos and Mikdashos, it also had, just like it would be later, that there was also a Melech, and also that the Yidden were already resting from their enemies, because as we said, in order for the Mikdash to be proper, you also need to have these other things. It's only that just like as far as the Beis HaMikdash itself is concerned, that the shleimus of the Beis HaMikdash for all future generations is going to be in the permanent Beis HaMikdash that was built in Yerushalayim. So too regarding these other conditions and these other gedorim as the introduction to have the Beis HaMikdash, you need these other things of a king and Milchemes Amalek. So we can understand that the shleimus was only properly in the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, but to a certain extent it existed already earlier. Says the Rebbe, this is why the Rambam brings the pasuk of Asuli Mikdash. And he immediately says that the Torah tells us about the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made, and that was temporary. In other words, that this mitzvah, in its simple sense, of building the Mikdash, Asuli Mikdash, what's it referring to? Simply it's referring to the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made. And with that they were already fulfilling the mitzvah of building a house for Hashem with all of the gedorim in it, because Moshe Rabbeinu is also a melech, as the Rambam himself tells us. And there was also already the fight with Amalek. They fought Amalek. There was also already the rest from the fighting of Amalek. As the pasuk says, Vayachlosh Yeshua's Amalek, Ves Amoy Leficharav, Yeshua weakened Amalek and his nation by the sword. So from then on, as soon as these things were done, you have a melech already, Moshe Rabbeinu. They fought Amalek. From now there is already the command of Asuli Migdash. And this remains now for all times. Says the Rebbe, according to this, we can understand why the Rambam is Meirich. He elaborates, starting with the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made. And he says that was temporary. And then he continues and he says, once the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael, they set up the Mishkan in Gilgal for 14 years when they conquered and they divided Eretz Yisrael. What's the Rambam coming to say with this? He's coming to say that this mitzvah of Asuli Migdash by the Mishkan of Moshe was a command that continued now for all future generations, and they fulfilled it. When they set up the Mishkan, now, for example, when they come into Eretz Yisrael in Gilgal, the difference is only how they're fulfilling it. That is the Mikdash that Moshe Rabbeinu made. Since it's being done in the Midbar and it is being remade again and again from one travel to the next. So that was more in a temporary way. That's called a Mishkan or an Oyhel. It's only temporary. And therefore, that way of performing the mitzvah, that continued. And also when they came into Eretz Yisrael, as long as there was still under temporary conditions before the 14 years were over, when they're conquering Eretz Yisrael and dividing Eretz Yisrael. And at that time, Yeshua is the Melech. And what happens next? Then they come to Shiloh. When they come to Shiloh, Yidden are already in a much more settled way, in a much more rested way, in a much more peaceful way. It's more settled in Eretz Yisrael. This is already after they conquered and divide Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, what do they build now? Now they build a house of stone. It's no longer an oil, no longer a tent, as it was till then. In fact, it stands for 369 years, as the Rambam tells us. Even afterwards, the Rambam goes on, when Eli passes away, it was destroyed. They come to Noiv and they build a mikdash over there, and Shmuel passes away and it was destroyed. They come to Givoin. The Rambam tells us that together Noiv and Givoin are 57 years. In other words, what's the Rambam telling us? That also in regards to Noiv and Givoin, he uses the term Ubanu Sham Mikdash. In other words, it's a much more permanent type of structure already. Although the Aron wasn't there. And in some places it's considered like a Bama Gdoila. But the idea is that the mitzvah of Binyan Beis HaMikdash existed. They had it already. It's only that because they didn't come to the ultimate full menucha yet, so therefore it's not a permanent place yet. It's not the Beis Olamim. And that's why the Rambam goes on to say, from there they now came to the Beis Olamim, because then they already have a time of a Melech B'Shleimus, they have David HaMelech, they have Shlomo HaMelech, they also have the complete menucha from Milchemes HaMelech. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why in the beginning of Ilchas Malachim, the Rambam tells us about these three mitzvahs. And why here he brings the pasuk of L'Shichnei Sidri Shuv Vasasham and not the pasuk of Asuli Migdash. He also doesn't bring the pasuk that says clearly about the Beis HaMikdash that we quoted before. Because what's the Rambam talking about over here? Here he's speaking about what happens when the Yidden come into Eretz Yisrael. After they conquered, after they divided, there's the three mitzvahs we spoke about. That right away, immediately over here, they have the ability and they're fulfilling the three mitzvahs that were commanded, which, as we said, are dependent on each other, even though, again, b'shleimus it won't be, perfectly it won't be, till they have the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. So what happens now? They have already a structure, a house, as we said in Shiloh, no longer a tent. It's already after the 14 years of conquering, of dividing, it's already a state of menucha, of rest, of peace in Eretz Yisrael. And that happens through Yeshua, which we said he was appointed as a king. He was appointed through Moshe Rabbeinu and his Beis Din, as the proper mitzvah of appointing a king needs to be for generations, based on a Beis Din of 70 Skenim and a Navi. In fact, the Rebbe says the Mishkan that was temporary in the Midbar was not in such a menuchadik way, and the way Moshe Rabbeinu was Melech was also not in the same way that he was appointed as all of the dinim of Minui Melech. So here it's already in a much more permanent and proper way. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we could also answer a question that there is regarding the halach in Hilchas Beis Abchira, which in other words, we could learn out a certain halacha b'poil. That is, the Rambam paskins that a person is not allowed to make a house, a structure, copying the same way as the heichal. A person is not allowed to make a porch or a balcony similar to the ulam. A person is not allowed to make a courtyard similar to the hazara. Now, since all of these previous structures we just said have a din of the mikdash, as we explained, by each and every one of them we're fulfilling the mitzvah of Asuli Mikdash. In fact, even the Beis HaMikdash itself, although its shape, its form, the details of its length and its width were different than the Mishkan, nevertheless the main parts of it are similar to the Mishkan, as the Rambam writes, that they make they make a mechitza around the Heichel, distant from it, similar to the curtains that were the Chatzar and the Midbar, and everything surrounded within that Mechitza is similar to the Chatzar of the Oyel Moyed, which are now in the Beis HaMikdash, that will be called the Azara. So says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we could say that this Isur of making a copy of the Beis HaMikdash would apply also in copying the Mishkan Shiloi, Noiv, and Givon, because really in each and every one of them is being fulfilled this mitzvah of Asuli Mikdash. The Rebbe now turns to Pnimi Yisoyin Yanim, and the Rebbe says, regarding the toichen of the three mitzvahs that we spoke about in Chassidus, it's explained that the mitzvah of Soim Tasam Alech HaMelech, appointing a king, represents the darga of yira, of fear, of awe. Because a melech, his inyan, is, he fears Hashem in an extra in an extra strong way. It's completely batel, nullified to Hashem, and through the Melech, this yira, this bitul, comes down also to the rest of the people. When a person reaches this level of yira, this level of fear, which is, in the language of Chassidus, also the idea of iskafia, where he's just subduing or bending the bad, the next step is mechiyas hamalik, to completely eradicate, to get rid of all sorts of bad. And that happens through the avodah of ishapcha. And only then a person can and needs to come to the next level called Yira Ilah, the highest level of awe and fear, which comes through the Beis HaMikdash, as it says, Mikdash Yiro, that we get a special level of fear, of awe from the Beis HaMikdash. And this Yira comes from the level of Chachma, from the idea of Torah. And the Rebbe says the same thing is true in each and every generation, also in the time of Galus. Once the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, we know there's the concept of Daled Amis Shel Halacha. Says the Rebbe, according to this, we can understand why the mitzvah for building the Beis HaMikdash and for the building of the first Mikdash, the Mishkan B'Poyel, had to happen through Moshe Rabbeinu. And as the Rambam is medayik and says, we quoted this before, Kfar Nisparish B'Torah, the Torah tells us clearly about the Mishkan Sha'asa Moshe Rabbeinu. Because this level of bringing down das, knowledge to each and every yid, through which a person can come to Yira, happens through Moshe Rabbeinu. As we know, it says on the pasuk, the Ata Yisrael, and now Yisrael, what is Hashem demanding of you? Kiyim liyira, but only to fear. The Gemara asks, Atu Yira Milsa Zutrasi, is fear really such a small thing? And the Gemara says, yes. To Moshe Rabbeinu, it's a small thing. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is the one that brings about the idea of Yira. And therefore, the whole idea, the beginning of Melucha, which again is referring to the first level of Yira, and all the way up till the binyan of the Mishkan, which is the idea of Yira Ilah, all happens through Moshe Rabbeinu. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, the idea of the Mishkan and the Mikdash, as Razal say, it says that Hashem says, "V'asuli Mikdash shachanti b'soicham," not b'soichoi. Hashem is going to dwell in each and every yid, that each and every yid is able to and needs to accomplish a Mishkan and a Mikdash shachanti b'soicham inside of himself. And the koyach for this is also through the Moshe that exists inside of himself. As the Alter Rebbe says, and the Alter Rebbe explains on this thing that we said before, that yes, the Moshe Rabbeinu, fear is a small thing, says the Alter Rebbe that this is referring to the idea that each and every Yid has inside of him this idea of Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore Yira is a small thing, because the Pasuk says, what's Hashem demanding of you and of each and every Yid? On the other hand, the shleimus of the mitzvah of the Beis HaMikdash was only in the Beis HaElamim, in the permanent Beis HaMikdash, because the inyan of Malchus b'shleimus and begilui was accomplished through David HaMelech, all the way to the Gili of Malchus B'tachas HaShleimus, which will be in the time of Yamid Melech Beis David, when a king will come up from the house of David. Hoige b'Torah, learning Torah, involved in Torah and in mitzvahs David like his father David, and get all the other Yidden to go in its paths and to strengthen all matters of Yiddishkeit, and fight the wars of Hashem and build a Mikdash b'Mkoimoi, which then there will be the idea of Melech b'Shleimus and destroying the Zari Shal HaMalek b'Shleimus. There will be the Hashem Shalem, the Akisei Shalem. Hashem's name will be complete, and Hashem's throne will be complete. The Gili of Malchus of Hashem and the Shleimus of the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, the eternal Binyan, the Beis HaMikdash that Hashem Himself makes, Meheir v'Yameinu b'Karev Mamash.